Welcome to my 260th video on my work with OO gauge. In this video I'll be revisiting the 3-rail kit-built model of an LMS Patriot locomotive that I featured in my previous video in an attempt to do a better job of repairing the crosshead rails which were broken off when I received the model. See my previous video, part 259, for broader info about this model and the history of the Patriot class. When I unpacked this model after delivery, the part, seen at bottom right here, fell out loose. I realised after a bit of inspection that the loose part represented the rails on which the crosshead was supposed to run from the left side of the loco. Here you can see the loose part and the complete assembly on the right-hand side, with the crosshead rails properly in place. Here's the left-hand side of the loco after my initial repair. The result wasn't very satisfactory. I tried to stick the rails onto the back of the cylinder with CA glue, but they really wouldn't sit straight at all, so they didn't look right. And this was actually my second attempt. The rails fell off again after my first attempt. Here's the right-hand side again with the rails properly fitted. In reality, the crosshead would actually be fixed over those rails so that it was only able to move back and forth on the rails, so keeping the action of the drive rod coming out of the cylinder straight. This model didn't have any way of actually fitting the crosshead onto the rails, so far as I could see. I suppose the hope was that the rod from the cylinder would keep the motion of the crosshead more or less straight, so that it would appear to be running on the rails. It would have really helped my repair attempts if I could have disassembled the drive and valve gear and removed the crosshead altogether so that I could fit the rails properly without the crosshead in the way. However, the drive and valve gear was all riveted together, so there was no easy way to disassemble it. Here you can see the drive rod attached to the centre driving wheel, with the eccentric for the valve operation attached by the same rivet. On most commercial models, this attachment would be done with a screw-in crank pin, or at worst with a push-in crank pin. This riveted version could only be disassembled by cutting or drilling out the rivets, and then it would need to be somehow riveted back together, something I definitely didn't feel like getting into. I undid the screw holding the body onto the chassis at the back, as I definitely needed to have the chassis out of the body to attempt a new repair. Then I undid the screw holding on the front bogie so that I could get that bogie out of the way. It was extremely tricky to get the rails into place. The rail assembly was hard to hold and manipulate in tweezers. It tended to pivot when I didn't want it to. And the rails had to be slid in behind the crosshead, so there wasn't enough room to use pliers to hold the rails. I tried. I used a knife to scrape away my own old glue and the remains of the original solder from the back of the cylinder. This revealed that there were actually square holes in the back of the cylinder into which the crosshead rails were supposed to fit. I hadn't realised this before. I apologise for this picture being out of focus, but I've included it as it was the only picture that I took that actually shows both of the holes for the rails in the back of the cylinder. After a good deal of fiddling around, I managed to fit the ends of the rails into the holes in the back of the cylinder and to apply some CA glue to keep them in place. I applied the glue by putting a drop on the end of a toothpick and then trying to smear it off the toothpick where I wanted it. I was rather annoyed to see that some of my glue ran down the outside of the cylinder. I didn't notice this when I was working, as these pictures show things considerably more clearly than I am actually able to see them in real time, even whilst wearing magnifying glasses. With the rails glued into the back of the cylinder, I completed the repair by gluing the bracket from the rails to the motion bracket at the top. It doesn't really work now because, you see, there's nothing holding the crosshead onto the rails is the problem. It doesn't have any claws or anything, so it's moving up and backwards and forth in front of the rails, but but it's not actually on the rails, and there's no way I can make it run on the rails because it doesn't have anything to attach it to the rails. So that's really the best I can do, I think. I refitted the front bogie and assembled the chassis back into the body. No good deed goes unpunished. Whilst I was doing that, one of the smoke deflectors fell off. The trouble with these kit-built models, although they're very nice and detailed and everything, is that they're very delicate and bits seem to be constantly falling off them. I glued the smoke deflector back into place with CA. It appeared to have been originally glued in place rather than soldered. So here is the model after repairs and reassembly. Even my new repair is less than perfect. Since the crosshead doesn't really hook over the rails at all, it doesn't entirely appear to be running on the rails, as it really should, but still I do think it looks a lot better now than it did before. I got the model back onto my 3-rail tracks for some running, but this wasn't initially very successful. The model didn't run when I applied power on the tracks, so I took it back to the bench and it ran fine there. Then I took it back to the tracks and it ran, but halfway round the loop it stopped dead again and refused to respond. So I took it back to the bench again. I did notice trying it on the bench that it would run okay mostly, but that it was fairly easy for the front bogie to get into a position where it touched the front centre rail contact. This would result in a short circuit, stopping the motor from working, as the centre rail pickups must be electrically isolated from the chassis. I couldn't find any other problems, so I can only hypothesize that this shorting was what was sometimes preventing the model from running. When I used a cotton bud to hold the wheels of the front bogie away from the centre rail pickup, the motor ran fine. So, after much frustrating back and forth, I once more got the model onto the tracks, and finally got it to run round okay. Finally, I coupled it up to the articulated coach set again for some running. I'm having one of those frustrating days where things work, and then they cease to work for no apparent reason. And you poke them and they still won't work, so, I've had this back and forth. I got it part way round, it stopped at the back, just wouldn't go, took it back to the bench, it worked fine. Brought it back here, wouldn't work, took it to the bench, it worked okay. I'm not sure I got to the bottom of things now. Part of the problem, I think, is that the front bogie has a bit of a tendency to short circuit to the front centre rail pickup. Certainly if it derails it can. I'm not even too sure that it can't short circuit on bends. So it's a bit iffy, that is. Although you can certainly get it to run sometimes, because I've had it running before. But let's see if it'll run now. It was running a minute ago when I took... Well, a minute ago, 10 minutes ago when I tried it before I went to get the video camera, but we'll see. Oh, I've never managed... I don't know whether that is... Is that because it's... No, I think that's just dirty track. Although, I say that, but I've cleaned that track incessantly. I've had that... what the heck? I don't know. And it's always hesitated on that point. Anyway, we got round, at least. Is it going to go through the tunnel without stopping? Nope. It just... Well, didn't even touch it that time. I just put the controller down and it started again. It's interesting, isn't it? Just putting the controller down created enough movement of something or other to make the thing start working. Give it a bit more power so it can speed over that. Ooh, that wasn't very good, was it? It slowed down, but it did get going. One more time round if I can get it round, and then I'm going to... Well, I'll have that tunnel up and clean again, but... There you go. Not that it wasn't going before, it was going before, but the problem was I wasn't happy with the way that drive gear, those crosshead rails were repaired. I do think I've got a better repair now. So I will move on to something else next, I think.